We're gonna start in a couple minutes. Well, pretty soon actually. I'm just gonna get my juice box ready. Because, you know, it's always nice to have it. I like these peach tea juice boxes that I have, and I go through so many of these, dude. And in this house, usually like the juice boxes come in like packs of 6, right? The juice boxes never last longer than like 2 days. Not in this house. Anyway, hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the book of Luke, and today we are going to read chapters 11 and 12. So we're just going to start right away. If you want to follow along, I will be using the New International Version. And that is starting from Luke 11 and 12. Well, before that, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I pray that today, as we read today, you continue to draw us closer to you. And through the acts of Jesus, we would know your heart so much more. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is the Christ. Amen. Okay, so just a little TLDR of the stuff that's been going on so far in the book of Luke. So Jesus is he's made quite some headway in his ministry at this point in the story. And, you know, he's gotten quite a following, and Jesus expands this quite a bit by having his disciples go to, you know, ahead of him into various towns that he plans on visiting. And with that, it really puts this level of excitement and expectation in the people in those regions. And so with that, you know, Jesus has gained a lot of momentum. That's kind of what's going on here. And, you know, we've already had quite a few large-scale miracles start happening at this point as well. So Jesus' notoriety is significantly high at this point. And so, you know, most Bible scholars assume this is probably at least a year, maybe almost 2 years into the ministry, because once again, the Bible, the way that the Bible is written itself doesn't actually give us a clear when during the 3 years, because according to other historians, Jesus had done ministry for roughly 3 years. And so the Gospels don't really exactly put dates on when Jesus does basically anything. And so we're just kind of guessing as to when during the ministry this happens, but we can safely assume it might be 2 years, so we might be on the actually latter half, which is weird to think that we're not even halfway through the book of Luke yet. And I'm making the claim that we're more than halfway through Jesus's ministry. But then again, when you get to the later parts of Luke, and this is true across the other Gospels as well, all the later chapters tend to just be like the last month. So with that said, the other chapters, it's just kind of ambiguous moments within the rest of that 3-year period that Jesus is doing ministry. Well, of course, we know he's not in the early part anymore because he's done quite a few large-scale miracles, like the feeding of the 5 bread 2 fish miracle, and stuff like that, and calming the weather and stuff like that. So Jesus obviously has gained a lot of traction, and so it's safe to assume Jesus is pretty far in his ministry time period. So that's why I make the claim that we're roughly 2 years in. But once again, the Bible doesn't actually give us much more clearer, like, a time frame, because the Bible doesn't really care to do that. Because once again, as I mentioned before, a lot of the Gospels, well, basically all of them really, are written in the format of, they're just compilations of various, I guess, the equivalent of Sunday sermons. Basically, as I mentioned before, how church was in the first century was very different from how we have it now, because of course now we're much more systematic, is the fancy word that people like to use. We're a lot more systematic in our method, like the way that church is done, because the context is in the first century, as depicted in the book of Acts, for instance. Church was more like an extension of the Jewish obligation of doing all the other Jewish rituals, going to the synagogue on the Sabbath and yada, yada, yada. And then talking about Jesus and all the stuff he's done and him being the Messiah and all that. That was something the Christians did on their own, aside, one, to not get in trouble with the other Jews, and two, for in their mind, Jesus was the extension of Jewish life. Of course, there was some controversy that comes up later on, as we'll eventually get there in the book of Acts, how Gentiles had to deal with this kind of thing too. And then, of course, out of that came the evolution of systematic ecclesiology, is the word that we use in Christianese. Ecclesiology is basically the idea of the study of church and church life. And so, with that said, that did not evolve until quite a bit later anyway. But as far as the first century is concerned, when they were, having the Christians were having these meetings, talking about Jesus and whatnot, it was all just more like a bunch of guys just hanging out, just talking about how awesome Jesus was and all the stuff he does, and not really like the way we formulate sermons now. It's very different. Of course, as time passed, the early Christians had to start writing this stuff down because, a lot of them were getting older and dying. So there's that. The passage of time comes for us all. But as that happened, they started writing this stuff down much later. And then, of course, that all gets compiled. And then that eventually makes the Gospels. And the Gospels, because they're kind of made that in that way, exact time frames of when Jesus does anything is not really relevant. And so, in a lot of ways, and the way I've been treating it, not just me though, but like the Bible translators, as they divide up chapters within the Bible books, and this is not just true in the New Testament. They also use this writing mechanism in the Old Testament as well. But basically, the chapters are kind of cut up to be like episodes, if you will, of the life of Jesus, if you will. And so, with that said, that was the attitude of which the early Christians took, these writing. Sorry, just give me a second. I'm just going to plug my phone in and then we're going to start reading. Start actually reading, because I just gave you a lot of kind of background information. But with that said, we now move to chapter 11. Chapter 11. So one day Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." And Jesus said to them, "When you pray, say, 'Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us of our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And lead us not into temptation.'" Then Jesus said to them, "Suppose you have a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. A friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have no food to offer him.' And suppose the one inside answers, 'Don't bother me. The door is already locked, and my children and I are in bed. I can't get up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not," Jesus says, "I tell you, even though he will not get up and give you the bread because of friendship, yet because of your shameless audacity, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. And so I say to you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to one who knocks the door will be open. Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, he will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask?" Now Jesus was driving out a demon that was mute, and when the demon left, the man who had been mute spoke, and the crowd was amazed. But some of the people said, "By Beelzebub, the prince of demons, he is driving out demons." Others tested him by asking for a sign from heaven. Well, Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, "Any kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and a house divided against itself will fall. If Satan is divided against himself, how can his kingdom stand? I say this because you claim that I drive out demons by Beelzebub. Now if I drive out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your followers drive them out? So then they will be your judges. But if I drive out demons by the finger of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. When a strong man, fully armed, guards his own house, his possessions are safe. But when someone stronger attacks and overpowers him, he takes away the armor in which the man trusted and divides up his plunder. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. When an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places, seeking rest, and doesn't find. Then it will say, 'I will return to the house I left.' When it arrives, it finds that the house is swept clean and put in order. Then it goes and takes 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. As the final condition of that person is worse than the first." As Jesus was saying these things, a woman in the crowd called out, "Blessed is your mother who gave you birth and nursed you." And Jesus replied, "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it." As the crowds increased, Jesus said, "This is a wicked generation. It asks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was assigned to the Ninevites, so also the Son of Man to be this generation. The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with the people of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the far ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And now something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will stand up at judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. Now no one lights a lamp and puts it in a place where it will be hidden, or under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand so that those who come in can see the light. Your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eyes are healthy, your whole body is also full of light. But when they are unhealthy, your body is full of darkness. See to it, then, that the light within you is not darkness. Therefore, if your whole body is full of light, and no part of it is dark, it will be just as full of light as when a lamp shines its light onto you. Verse 37. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Then the Lord said to them, Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. Oh, you foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now as far as what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean to you. Oh, woe to you Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. So woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplace. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. One of the experts of the law answered him, Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. And Jesus replied, And you experts in the law, oh woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, but it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you built their tombs. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill, and other they will persecute. So therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that had been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Oh yes, I say to you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Now woe to you experts of the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely, and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in chapter 11. We're going to be here for a while, so buckle up. Alright, so first, we have Jesus teaching his disciples about stuff, and, how they can rely on God, basically, is what he's teaching them. And so, At the beginning of this of chapter 11, we get the shorthand version of the Lord's Prayer. The fame and in the book of Matthew has the longer version. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, yada yada yada. And so in the book of Luke, it's kind of shorthanded. But in the Luke version here, it focuses on how God provides for the everyday life. The famous "Give us this day our daily bread," and then "Forgive us of our sins as we forgive the sins of others." And do not lead us into temptation, but protect us from the evil one. Yada yada yada. So Luke focuses on that part, the day-to-day kind of thing. How people like you and I, go about our lives. And I think it's interesting because one of the things about the book of Luke that a lot of people, the book of Luke focuses a lot on the Christian lifestyle of caring for others. A lot more than some of the other gospels, that's for sure. For instance, the book of John hardly ever addresses it. It focuses more on the validity of Jesus' ability to provide for us, and by extension, then you can read Luke in that better context of how we ought to take care of others. But I'm going to leave the book of John out for now and just focus on what's going on in the beginning of chapter 11 here. And so Jesus tells this funny ass story about a guy who, awakes his neighbor. And his neighbor at first is kind of like, "What do you want? Like, go away. Can you not tell? Like, it's late at night. I'm sleeping. Like, leave me alone." But the weird thing in this story is that Jesus talks about how the latter, the guy who was asleep, he still ends up doing the favor, not out of the goodness of his heart, but because it serves his purpose. Which is a weird thing for Jesus to tell people about the nature of God. Now, I know this can be a little bit weird, and I know some people may get uncomfortable with this a little bit. But I know when a lot of people make their criticisms about Christianity, and one criticism that comes up is that, well, why does God do anything for people? If God doesn't need people, he doesn't need, like, for example, worship is not necessary. God doesn't need that from people. And so, God, what incentive is there for God to do anything, really? Especially for people. That's a big critique. And one of the answers that's given, though I can understand why a lot of people don't like it, is when a lot of Christians use the Christianese language of like, God does it to glorify himself. And then the criticism that comes after that is like, well, that makes God sound really egotistical, right? That he would only do things to make himself look better. Which is a fair criticism. But at the same time, the flaw with the criticism is when people make that criticism, you ignore how most human beings behave. And I know I dance on this quite a bit, and I know it makes some people uncomfortable. But at the same time, if you actually don't read scripture this way, you're actually doing yourself a disservice. And you're actually being kind of dishonest with the Bible, which is, in my mind, way worse. So I'd rather kind of think a bit more dangerously, but try and be accurate, than for people to try and say God can do no wrong and then end up putting themselves in a logical corner kind of thing. But basically, as I've always mentioned in a lot of my other books, especially in the book of Exodus, which you should definitely check out that playlist, there's a lot, like, I think that one of the things that we tend to forget is that God can appear to act very human at times, not so much because God is more human than we think, but rather human beings are more quote-unquote godlike than we think ourselves to be. And that is one of the better ways of interpreting the famous passage that lots of Christians love quoting, but no one really likes to delve what this passage actually means. In Genesis, also check out that playlist. In Genesis, when God talks about how humans are made in his image, well, what the hell does that mean for humans to be made in the image of God? And that's an answer that has like a cornucopia. That's a question with a cornucopia of answers. But basically, one of the answers is that we possess a lot of traits that God himself possesses. And so one of the things that God does have, and it's easy for us to criticize God because we think, well, if God is so perfect, he shouldn't have this quality. But I think that's a wrong way of looking at it. It's more accurately how the Bible portrays it is that because of sin, we've allowed ourselves to become too self-absorbed in this quality that God also has. And one of those qualities is that we do things to serve ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that on, a surface level. And realistically, you think of anything of, if you do anything for anyone, you should always be suspicious of people who claim there are no strings attached. Always be suspicious. Because no one does that in real life. No one does that. And so for God to do that as well, let me backtrack. Let me word it better. It would be dishonest to say, well, God would do things for people with no strings attached. That's a ridiculous idea. Now, I know a lot of people would think, well, God could do that because God is all powerful, and so his resources to provide for people is infinite. So therefore, God can give freely, be infinitely, because God is infinite. See, when human beings do that, we do something to expect something in return. When we do that, there's a clear logic that any sensible human being can easily follow, and we all accept it. Okay, so for instance, me doing this stream and trying to give you, Bible education. Obviously, there's something in it for me. Recognition on YouTube, making me look better before God. Let's be real. As I mentioned on Monday, a bit of spite against all the other churches that give me shit over the years. Stuff like that. There's something in it for me, and it would be dishonest for me to say that there isn't something in it for me doing these streams, for example. But with something like this, you don't think like, oh, it's a big deal, right? It's just a bit of your time. But then again, time is a very important currency. And it's easy to think about these kind of exchanges when you think about like when money is directly involved, right? And people will do stuff like, for example, your job, any job. You never do anything. Everything you do at your job, you always expect something. Well, one is a paycheck. And then, of course, there are other things you expect out of your workplace. You expect recognition, hopefully a promotion down the line. You expect respect from your coworkers as you work well and stuff like that. You expect something, and you always expect something because, one, there's a survival instinct to it. Those who can get the most out of others are the ones who survive. So when you do things for other people, you tend to expect things because that's a survival thing. You cannot give yourself to the point of self-deprecation. That makes no logical sense. And so to put this in a human perspective, that's a very easy thing to justify, that people do things because they expect something. But I know a lot of people make criticisms toward God saying, well, why should God behave that way? Why should God expect anything back when he does something for people? Because, and once again, this is a very tough question because I can't give you a one-to-one ratio with like human beings. As human beings, the logic behind why human beings do that is very straightforward. It's an A to B straight line, right? The logic behind it is clear cut. Whereas once again, that logic would not apply to God because once again, God doesn't have to do it for survival. He's immortal. God doesn't need recognition from people. He is above people. So why would God do things for people, but yet still expect something in return? And so my answer for it, once again, this is my answer, and so you just gotta take this with a grain of salt. But God does it because he wants to inspire within his love game, his love risk game. That's what I called it. The love risk game. If you remember from, what was it? Was it last week or 2 weeks ago? I definitely talked about this. The love risk game God does for him to be loving. Well, God has to do an exchange. It cannot come for free. And so God puts that upon himself to behave in a quote-unquote dickish way, to expect something from people that could not possibly repay him. But he has to expect it, because otherwise human beings could not reciprocate love. And you think about it like in real life. If an example of this is spoiled children, like really spoiled children. You know those children you see on TV and you hate the shit out of them because they act like such brats and they act so entitled, and when one thing doesn't go remotely their way, they made the biggest scene about it, because in a spoiled brat's mind, everything is supposed to go their way. And the reason why they think that is because they have been basically given everything and nothing was ever expected from them. And so when that comes up, they get very angry about it. You know, we make jokes about like the Karens and stuff like that. And they expect things just to go their way. And they always expect others to just give up everything for them. That's ridiculous, though, in real life. That doesn't happen. So when God makes an exchange with humans, in a way, once again, it's kind of a weird paradox, because what Jesus teaches here in Luke 11 is kind of he goes on the other side of the coin, basically, of this kind of logic. And the logic I'll give you is the more positive side of the coin. Jesus likes to play on the more negative side, and he does that a lot. I mean, I get that he does that because I too have a dark sense of humor. So that's why maybe I can see it. But basically, the positive side is that God expects things out of people because in his love, he wants to teach us as humans how to love and to respect ourselves and to respect others. And so when Jesus expects things, or when God expects things from people in return for him doing stuff for them, he's also teaching people that that's how they should behave with each other, and to be appreciative when people do favors for each other. And so with that said, though, because God, it's a high priority in God's mind that human beings are good to each other. That's the whole idea of the law in the Old Testament, was that God wants people to be good to each other. And so going back to this parable Jesus tells about this neighbor who only provides for his neighbor out of an obligation. And I'm going to use that word strongly. It's an obligation. And so in God's mind, it's an obligation to help people because he wants to teach people how to be good to each other. Because there's the whole thing of, well, if God is not the example of how people should help each other, then people won't help each other. Because you think about human nature in a nutshell, humans are much more selfish, and we'll only do things to help ourselves. But God is trying to teach us to not think and act that way. And so he acts as the example of helping others so that we as human beings would help each other as well. It's a weird transient of logic like that. And so Jesus uses the flip side of talking about the obligation. That God puts upon himself this obligation to help people. Just like how in the story, the neighbor puts upon himself the obligation to help, the guy who knocks on his door at night. Because the funny thing about the story is that the guy already gave a perfect excuse not to help. He's like, no, I'm in bed. All right, it's bedtime. I'm sleeping. All right, I got to rest up for who knows what. I got to rest up for work the next day. Maybe we got a trip with the family tomorrow, or maybe I've been sleep deprived because I have a newborn baby or something. Like something like that. And the neighbor in the story, he's already justified himself of why he doesn't have to help the guy knocking on his door. He's already justified himself. But then he puts it upon himself and obligates himself to help this guy anyway, which is kind of weird. He does it anyway, out of an obligation. And then Jesus parallels this with that's how God acts. God puts it upon himself to have an obligation to help others. And then, with that said though, even though it's weird to think that God would put an obligation on himself to help people, even though, human beings really don't deserve God's help, because we're pretty terrible in general. But for God to have put it upon himself, this obligation to help people, is interesting. And Jesus continues that train of thought by talking about how, well, think about how you put upon yourself an obligation to help those who are close to you. And so he uses the metaphor of fathers helping their sons and providing for their kids. And so he's like, well, if you can provide for your kids, and you guys are pretty wretched people, if you can provide for your kids, well, how much more can God do that for you? And so it's interesting that the logic Jesus uses is this obligation that God has that he puts upon himself, because once again, God is not actually obligated to do anything. But this is a weird thing about the nature of God, that where we talk about how if God can do anything, then what's to stop him from doing something evil, kind of idea. But obviously God puts certain limiters on himself as his character, in order for God to be good, in order for God to be loving and all that. God must put certain limiters on himself. So if God is to be good, then he puts a limit on himself that he won't do bad things. If God is to be love, he must put limiters on himself that he won't do things that are tyrannical or obsessive. And so, in this same vein, God puts a limiter on himself that he will not turn away from those who need help. That he won't do that. And he puts that upon himself to say, like, okay, I made an oath. Basically, God makes an oath to himself that he will help people and he will make himself feel obligated to do so. And that's the weird thing about this beginning story, because once again, Jesus uses like this negative example of a guy who's like, go away, leave me alone, but then he does it anyway. In the same way, God is justified not to help us, but he does it anyway. Which, the good thing out of that, though, is, once again, we have that assurance that if we call upon, the Lord for, in our prayers, for whatever we need in our lives, and for, our spiritual help and even physical needs, God will provide. God will be there, because God put it upon himself as an obligation to help people. All right, so we have a fun one here, the Jesus and Beelzebub bit. So, if you guys remember, I can't remember when I did this one. I think it was the Book of Kings stream. Might be one of the Book of Kings one. Definitely check out that playlist. Maybe we'll hit all of them again this time too. But anyway, just watch all my 2021 stuff. Basically, is what I'm advertising right now. But anyway, I referenced this story back when I was talking about the changing of names and how there was Beelzebub, one of the gods of the I can't remember whoever of the living among the Israelites, and the Israelites turned away from the Lord to worship Baal-zebub. But then we have Beelzebub here, and they're basically the same name, but of course the thing you have to consider is that they're through history and the changing of language, which is something I actually have never really brought up until now. How even among what the Israelites spoke to each other, the language greatly changed, and the language used in the Book of Kings versus the language used in the New Testament is very, very different. And that's obviously, like, that's kind of a duh. As in, like, you think about how, like, English has transformed over 400 years. Because you think of, like, how there was Middle English, which was, excuse me, whoa, sorry, burping in the mic there. There was that Middle English that was before, like, 1300s, and then after that we started having what is constituted as English. But then English was so different back in the 15th century, the 1400s. And then it got changed drastically by arguably one of the greatest writers of all time, William Shakespeare. And William Shakespeare actually is the guy responsible for a lot of modern English. But if you compare, like, English before Shakespeare and then English 100 years after Shakespeare, it was drastically different. And then it only got more different as time passed. And English greatly evolved as a language to, the stuff we speak now. In the same way, the language the Israelites spoke, it's not even the same Hebrew. And then there's the whole thing that Hebrew was more like a written language. It wasn't like the language people spoke, because there was a language called Aramaic, which was this bastardization, I guess you could say, of what Middle Easterns would speak. So once again, before Arabic, well, Aramaic had some Arabic in it, but Arabic also became was a more formalized language. It wasn't something people just spoke to each other. And let me rephrase that. The thing, too, is that Arabic, as a language, has been around for friggin' ever. But once again, similar to English and Hebrew and other languages, Arabic has gone through, like, so many evolutions. And Arabic today is completely different from what it was, like, 400, 500 years ago. It's completely different. Of course, that's the reason why written languages are so important, and why a culture needs a written language. Because people may say, like, 500 years ago they spoke Arabic, but we don't know if it's like remotely the same. And even the writing is different, the way people wrote. And once again, that's not a surprising idea. You look at English and how much it's changed. And English has gone through rapid evolutions because technology and the internet exists. English is drastically different from, like, the 1960s. Or even later than that, the 1980s. You look at English in the 1980s and English in 2022, they're completely different. They're almost completely different. Because English has changed so much. And the way that we speak and use words and the meaning of words has drastically changed. In, the 80s to 20, that's like 40 years. So, that, like, a lot has changed in 40 years in the English language. So it's no surprise when you think of how older languages, using, like, Arabic as an example, or Hebrew in the Bible's example, how much language has changed. And I bring this up because, the whole Baal-zebub and Beelzebub are basically the same name. But in the New Testament, the bastardization pronunciation comes from basically an Aramaic take. And Aramaic is this language that was kind of a mix of Hebrew. There was a bit of Hebrew, obviously. There was some Arabic. And then there's also a lot of Greek and Roman influences into that language, just like how in English we have influences from other languages. We have influences from German, obviously, and then there's French and Spanish influences. And that's why some words, one of the things that's annoying to learn English definitely as a second language. See, if you're a native English speaker, you kind of pick up on these nuances pretty quickly. But if you're learning English as a second language, and when certain sets of letters make certain sounds in one context, but in other contexts it makes a different sound. And one is because, oh, this is actually from a derivative of a Spanish word, so it would make this sound, or whatever. In the same way, Aramaic is a similar kind of language. It had all these different influences from other languages, and people just kind of, and people generally spoke it because the convenience of Aramaic is that since Aramaic was basically a bastardization of every other language at the time, everybody would have an idea of how to speak Aramaic, even if the Romans were being like, oh, we speak Latin because we are the elites. But they would have a working they would have a working sense of Aramaic, and then the Israelites obviously had to learn Aramaic because, well, the Romans aren't going to let you get away with doing Hebrew only, and so the Israelites obviously learned Aramaic, and then you find there's like these weird moments where, and everyone makes these kind of jokes where like the universal language kind of thing, because there'll be moments where, like, definitely in the book of Acts you see this a lot more, where Israelites will talk to people from like pretty far away places, and they're all able to talk to each other, and the explanation is, well, because everybody has a working knowledge of Aramaic, just like how in the world today most people in the world have a working knowledge of English. And that's one of the conveniences of English, is English, once again, kind of just kind of absorbed things from every other language, and then just say, this is English. And then everybody uses it. And so this newer language, I should say, Aramaic, would have converted the word, back to what we were talking about originally, when it changed the word Baalzebub, because once again, who pronounces it Baal anyway? You play Diablo, they all say Baal, which is actually incorrect. It's actually Baal. But, I mean, no one's going to say Baalzebub. Doesn't sound half as cool. So, Beelzebub was the name that ended up being used as, like, once again, language evolved. And like, oh, let's just make it easy. And then, of course, there's that element, too, of how you evolve languages. You try to make things as easy to say as possible. You take out all those weird nuances that languages have. You try to just, like, the idea is, and a good example, if you were reading along with me, you look at the word Beelzebub. It's easy to say. And so, as language evolved, that would be a big, driving force of changing stuff like this. Words like Beelzebub. And even, a funny contrast is that the name Jesus is also a modern contrast. And it's actually, his name is like Joshua. But then, of course, in the Hebrew, it's like Yeshua, which then, actually, that's a shorthand for something else, because Jesus' actual name would be like Yehoshua or something like that. And so, but Yehoshua is a bit much to say. So, Jesus for short, right? And it works. And that's a name anyone can utter. Doesn't matter, what language you're from. Anyone can know the name, the name Jesus, which, in the Christian agenda, that works perfectly. Because if you want everybody to, believe in Jesus, well, you should present a name that's easy for everybody to say. Jesus is really easy to say. Yehoshua is not that easy to say. And once again, I know there's going to be some like Hebrew in here, some Hebrew speaker in here who's going to correct me. It's actually not pronounced Yehoshua. There's the nuances in the way it's pronounced. And before you start, just don't. I already know that. But it's a case in point that as language evolved, we wanted to make things easier to pronounce. So names like Beelzebub and even Jesus, they're kind of shorthanded and made easier to say so that people could say them. And for example, like, reading the Bible to you is a case in point. Like, just say Beelzebub is easier to say than like Beelzebub. It's way easier to say. Imagine all the effort, like every time I have to say Beelzebub and all the effort I have to put it every time instead of just saying Beelzebub. It just rolls off the tongue. See, like case in point, right? Case in point. Anyway, enough of the linguistics lesson. In this story, Jesus has a very interesting message. Because, of course, he likes... You know, when people read the Bible, sometimes they think, like, everything has to be spiritual. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes Jesus can just talk plainly and things make sense in in a very simple, logical way. And this story when the Pharisees accuse him of using the powers of Beelzebub, Jesus just goes like, really? Like, do you even listen to yourselves? Like, do you not realize that makes no logical sense? And I kind of find that it's kind of funny that Jesus does that here, where he's like, but why would you say I cast out demons by the name of a demon? That makes no sense. And so Jesus the Bible uses more words to basically say that by saying, well, if a house is against itself, wouldn't that house fall? Because in order for an army to conquer, you have to have a unified front. That's how every conquering nation's done it. Why would you think otherwise? And so I kind of found that a little bit funny, and that's not really all there is to this story. I just gave you the simple TLDR, and well, one, because I don't want to spend too much time on the story. There's no need to. And two, once again, you can explain it pretty easily because the story doesn't have a deep spiritual meaning. But rather, Jesus is simply pointing out the obvious, which is fun to see from time to time. Because, we have those moments, and, you see this, like, much later. The Olivet Discourse is a good example of this, where Jesus will speak on much more, meta-narrative level of things, and on a much more metaphorical and spiritual and hyperbolic, that's the word I was originally thinking of, much more hyperbolic ways. But you read something like chapter 11 here, and Jesus doesn't do that. He just goes like, no, I'm just going to say plainly, your statement makes no sense. And I think that's brilliant about this scene. Okay, moving on, because I spent enough time on the linguistics lesson. So verse 29, we have the sign of Jonah. Basically, this part has a lot of people like to use the typology of this scene, the Jonah story, and how it refers to Jesus' death. The typology is basically where there's a clear parallel between two stories. That's basically what a typology is. After all, you could look at it like this. A typology is when you're talking about a type of story. A typology. So, the typology is being dead for 3 days and being alive again. Now, in Jonah's case, maybe, once again, with the Jonah story, it's much more ambiguous, whereas in the Jesus story, it's much more literal. Being dead for 3 days and then alive again on the third day. And the son of Jonah's story is just kind of Jesus' smart-ass way. Once again, it's one of those things that, I just appreciate, especially when you read the Bible and you don't try and over-spiritualize everything. You just read it the way that, it's just laid there for you. And don't try and read. You don't need to read too much into it. It's just, the Bible's actually pretty straightforward about it. It's like, yeah, it's actually extremely satisfying. And Jesus' message is straightforward. He just goes, well, the only sign that you'll get and the only sign that you'll need is raising of the dead. That's it. Because everything else is irrelevant if there is no resurrection. End of story. Wow, that just made things easy. Because, of course, and once again, this is the fundamental of Christian thinking. If there was no resurrection, then who gives a shit about life, right? Because then, everybody just does stuff. You live, eat, do other stuff, sleep, grow old, and then you die. And that's it. If that was the end, then who cares about the entire process? If death was the end, that's it, right? And then no one would care. So then, why bother? But in Christian thinking, there's like, no, obviously, there has to, there is a life after this life. Because then that life makes the rest of it worth it. Hello, Forest Run. I think that's how you say it. Or is it really Forest Run? Okay, it's Forest Run. No, I thought it was just Forest Run. Like you're trying to come up with some kind of fancy name. But I was like, no. It's definitely a meme name, isn't it? It's Forest Run. I know the reference. I am that old. I mean, even if you're not an old person who's actually seen Forrest Gump, I'm pretty sure everybody knows that reference. It's an iconic moment in like movie history with the run Forrest run, and then like his leg braces break, and then Forrest is actually able to run. I think it's an iconic movie moment. Anyway, that's a sidetrack for another day, but basically, that's a movie moment everybody should just know. Maybe I should make a list of movies everybody should watch, because I have a list of books everybody should read. Maybe I should make a list of movies everybody should watch. But anyway, hello Forrest, welcome to the stream. Anyway, Jesus goes on about light and darkness. I always found this passage, the reference is Luke 11:33 to 36. I always found this passage kind of funny. And the reason why I find this passage kind of funny is because, like, whenever this is, like, talk about light, darkness, light and dark, light, dark, dark, light. It's, like, one of those things that... Something that's I always found funny about that talking, and maybe this is me as, like, a teenager, and some nostalgia, and at the same time annoyance as a teenager, was... I'm gonna bring up something cursed now by doing this. But like in Kingdom Hearts, a game that I loved as a teenager, and the whole theme is about like the battle of light and darkness. And so light, dark, light, light, dark. It's all in the dialogue. It's like it sounds kind of silly when they just keep using those two words over and over and over. And you kind of get this scene, you kind of get that sense when you read this passage. I don't know. I just thought that'd be fun. Funny. Hi, Swear Jar. Welcome to the stream. Anyway, but I don't know, the part where Jesus talks about like how and this is where the famous I should mention this part, the little pop culture knowledge, I guess you could say. Well, it's not really pop culture, but it's one of those things that like phrases we use is the eyes are the window to your soul. I mean, once again, it didn't start here. It's probably even older than this. Than what Jesus says here. That idea is probably even older. But Jesus is basically making that kind of reference. The eyes are the window to your soul. And he talks about, the light in your eye. If your eye is full of light, then the rest of you is full of light. And if your eye is exposed to darkness, then you have been tainted and are full of darkness, yada, yada, yada. See, it sounds like Kingdom Hearts all over again, see? But basically, the eyes are the window to your soul thing is definitely kind of pointed at here, and the way Jesus says it is very interesting. He talks about how like, well, that of course it makes sense that that's the case, because you think of the stuff you expose yourself to, and he uses the eyes as a metonymy of exposure, because of course eyes is usually the first, how do we say it, the thing that catches your eye, and so that will usually lead you to being curious about things and exploring other things. And so the rest of you gets immersed and it follows what you see. So that makes logical sense in that regard. And so Jesus is talking about here like how important it is to watch what you expose yourself to, because they can change you. And Jesus uses the Kingdom Hearts extremes of light and dark, dark and light. And yes, I will keep making that reference, because I mean, how does it not? But when you expose yourself to certain things, it does change you, and it's one of those things that we don't think about that much in the modern day, and I think the big problem is that we are so desensitized. And so, because once again, in our modern era, you don't even think of like with the with like the smartphone has like accelerated this process, but the entire world is basically in your fingertip, and you can see everything. You can see the entirety of the world, basically. Similar to how I talked about my very first podcast, how like you can basically know anything because the internet exists. In the same way, you can basically see the entire world through your palm, you know, because we have the smartphone. You can see the entire world, and so nothing you can be exposed to literally everything. And of course, there's good and bad elements to that. But of course, you have to watch what you watch because those things do affect you. I mean, here's the terrible example, but you know, there's a reason why there's so many campaigns again. I know sorry guys, I have to do this to you, but I have to use the terrible example. But for instance, of like, there used to be that whole campaign about like how damaging porn is, as a good example and bad example at the same time. Of, you know, if you think that, oh, just watching it won't be a big deal, but then it actually does affect the way that you live. And I've seen this happen to people, you know. And it's one of those things that it's easy to laugh about, where it's easy to laugh about how like, oh, you know, like the whole virgin thing with guys that like they act as incels because they don't know how to talk to women or whatever. But a lot of that does come from like exposure to stuff like pornography, and it taints the way that men interact with women, because then a lot of guys, when they expose themselves to that, it actually influences the way that they think in their attitudes of, well, how do I talk to women? And then a lot of guys who watch porn tend to have much more negative ways, and they're the guys who tend to act like complete dickbags, you know, to women, and say all the crude and nothing nice and always objectifying women. And then of course that's why like you have all those angry feminists about how like, oh, like all men talk about are boobs or whatever. It's like, no, that's not true. Will you relax? But like, I can see why they think that, even though it's wrong. But when you think of something like, oh, a, at the moment you might think, oh, you know, like a few videos of other people having sex is not gonna do that much damage to me. But then it does get into the subconscious, and people will carry that over of what they expect out of like a relationship and stuff like that, which is very, very toxic and very damaging. So the case in point here, you know, Jesus is talking about, you know, if your eyes are full of light, then inside the entirety of you is full of light. So if you're not exposing yourself to terrible things that may influence the way you interact with people, and using pornography is like the easy example. It just begs to be used sometimes, but like all puns intended. All puns intended. But you know, it just begs for that. But what Jesus says is so true. If you expose yourself to stuff like that, it will taint you, and then you will become full of darkness. Dark light, dark light, light dark. Anyway, get a bit of a move on here. The end of chapter 11. Now this is a lot more interesting. So basically, as I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, there's this whole thing where I mentioned how Jesus was gaining a lot of traction in his ministry at this point in time. But, and for the most part, it was all very positive. You know, he's doing miracles and driving out demons and other cool stuff like that in the countryside. But as more Pharisees and teachers of the law, probably from Jerusalem, probably, you know, started following him around and started to, you know, try and see what Jesus had to say. Jesus does basically a 180 on these guys and basically chews out the people in authority. And I know one of the things that's popular about these kind of passages is that a lot of people today tend to use Jesus to defend more communist ideas, which is kind of silly. but the idea that Jesus only is about the poor people and doesn't care, and Jesus hates the rich people. And if you're a rich person, you're inherently a bad person because you were probably an oppressor to get that money. That kind of idiotic logic. But a lot of people gravitate to using the Bible this way because of passages like this where Jesus chews out the people who are an elite. So I know a lot of people say, well, Jesus actually wouldn't like Christians very much because the Christians act like the Pharisees, and Christians are by definition the elite. And so, there's that weird kind of transience of logic. But anyway, there are passages like this where Jesus chews out the elites, and he starts doing that a lot after this passage. Like he's done it here and there before, but usually they're more like, specific. Like he chews out a particular Pharisee or a particular teacher of the law. He chews them out as individuals. But here he kind of does blanket statements, and that's where people get the impression that Jesus hates the rich, which is not true. But and Jesus only cares about the poor. Not necessarily true either. So, but it's through passages like this where Jesus is quick to turn on these guys and say, like, no, you guys are everything that's wrong. And once again, this is the logic a lot of people like to use, especially against Christians, where they say, well, see, Christians made God look bad, and so by doing that, God actually hates Christians and likes all the other people a lot more. And you always see like those Twitter memes of the God Twitter page where that guy trying to be, he's a total smartass, and sometimes he's pretty funny, but I mean, he does a lot of his stuff to be offensive. But the God Twitter page where he's like, oh, I don't endorse like most churches because of this and that, and these people know me more, like these people who have been worshiping nature know me better than like the average Christian and stuff like that. And that guy does his hot takes. But the point behind a Twitter page like that comes out of passages like this where Jesus is quick to shut down the elites because of a lot of the wrong that they've done. And yeah, it's true. There is some truth to that, right? That people who think they're in the right with God tend to be the ones that abuse that power. But I made this reference a while ago, and I'll say it again. But what people need to be humble about is that we are all capable of great evil, and we should all be humble of that. And so that's why we can never lord over other people that we're better than other people, because in a way, we're really not. And there's the other thing too, that there's just a lot of intellectual dishonesty, and this is something that like I warn fellow Christians about quite often. And I actually make a reference to a funny old play. Well, I guess it's pretty old now. To the play Wicked. If you guys don't know what the play Wicked is about, the TLDR is it's an origin story, quote unquote, of the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. And her name is Gwyneth in that story. And Gwyneth, basically the story of Wicked is about her accepting that she's a bad guy. That she will always be the Wicked Witch of the West. That can never change, is basically what the story is about. And there's an interesting quote that she has in the play. And Gwyneth says, those who say that they are evil tend to not be much worse than everyone else. It is the people who claim that they are good are the ones you have to be wary of. And that's something that quickly teeters-totters in the world today. Quickly teeter-totters. Teeters is not plural. Quickly teeter-totters in the world today. And so that's something that everybody needs to be a lot more honest with. And it is important to call that out in people, but at the same time, the problem in our modern society is that people are quick to point out stuff wrong in other people and then not look at themselves. And, we read that passage about the splinter, and, you look at the sliver in someone else's eye and not notice the log in your own, which goes back to that passage from a few weeks ago, back in Luke 6, I'm pretty sure it is. But basically, we can't be dishonest and say that, well, everyone else is the one that does wrong. They're it's always someone else who does wrong and not me, which is the most dangerous way of thinking, because those are the people who will do absolutely horrible things and then justify it by saying, no, but I did it for good. And, those people end up going down in history as like some of the worst people. Right? Adolf Hitler being a good example of that. Adolf Hitler never thought that he was doing something terrible. He thought he was doing what was in the best interest of Germany. And he would make the claims that, no, he was good. But, well, history, after seeing everything he did, and history correctly goes, no, you were pretty terrible. You were pretty terrible. And so, in the same way, people like to make those kind of associations with people who are higher up in power. And that's why, there's also that whole thing of why the other extreme, though, that a lot of people do today, though, is to play what I like to call the oppression Olympics. And so they like to say, like, well, I'm this oppressed class, I'm also this oppressed class, and you get points for being all the things that are oppressed in history. So race tends to be brought up often in this, gender identities, class, and, all the things that we're trying to move on from, but yet people in the world today always go back to them, because now we've gone the opposite extreme of what Jesus is pointing out here, as well as, what we've correctly been doing through history, which was pointing out when people in power have done wrong. But now we've gone a complete 180 and trying to play the oppression Olympics and try to make ourselves look good by saying we are not the oppressor class. But then, of course, people who do that tend to do things that become very oppressive. On a weird tangent, but I gotta talk about it a little bit at some point, because I didn't stream on Wednesday. Well, because the Nintendo Direct was on Wednesday, so that was a good reason why I didn't stream. It was a good thing I didn't stream. I didn't stream for different reasons, but it was a good thing I didn't stream on Wednesday, because I got to watch that. And Fire Emblem 3 Hopes, I'm that's not the biggest thing. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 was like the hugest thing for me in that Nintendo Direct. But I do actually think that Fire Emblem 3 Hopes looks pretty good. But anyway, tangent aside, in Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Edelgard uses that exact logic. She was the one that people did wrong. People in power, abused her and hurt her. And yeah, she had every right to be hurt, but that doesn't mean you get to turn an entire nation to wage war on everyone else because of your personal trauma. You don't get to do that to people. You don't get to use people like that and whatnot. And so, Edelgard's actions in Fire Emblem 3 Houses is kind of the same thing. Or let me, no, I'm sorry, not the same thing. It's that opposite, is that opposite extreme, the oppression Olympics thing. And so I want to get that out of the dark here, because as we talk about when Jesus chews out the Pharisees, it's so easy to want to play the oppression Olympics, because and then people actually use this passage to justify that behavior, which is actually kind of dangerous. But of course, when has the Bible not been used to, further someone's personal agenda to hurt others? And this passage, even though Jesus was correct to chew out the Pharisees, people have incorrectly used this passage to push their own agenda to hurt others. So I just wanted to get that out, because I think that one of the parts about the end of chapter 11 here is that is a major problem in modern Bible reading. But hopefully, I can help you read this part a lot better. and to always remember that it's about the glory of God as opposed to our personal feelings. All right, so Jesus chews out the Pharisees and the experts of the law. So it begins with Jesus going to some guy's house, and apparently they get mad because Jesus doesn't do the ritual washing. So I've mentioned this before too, but the ritual washing is basically like you have to wash your hands and your face a certain way and for a certain amount of time before you eat. Of course, we've adopted that into like always wash your hands before you eat because hygienic. But in ancient cultures, there was a tendency to just like spiritualize everything and ritualize everything. So something that, is common sense to us today, such as washing your hands, they ritualized it. And that's just how ancient world people were. You can't really slam that. I mean, we technically still do that today to an extent. We just like let me rephrase it this way. Sure, we may have moved away from specific religious context of why we do certain things. At the same time, we still accept the ritual and behave in a ritualistic way. So once again, the example of washing your hands before you eat. Now, the simple logic we use is, well, it's hygienic. You should do it. You should do it. But, a funny example, oh, this is going to be terrible. But, hey, you're on the Streaming Parson channel, so dark humor, you expect it here. So, when the whole COVID thing started, it's weird to think it's been just over 2 years now. But when the whole COVID thing started, people had to be told how to wash their hands. And everywhere you went, there was a little piece of paper above the sink. How to wash your hands. Like people didn't know how to wash their hands. Turn the water on. Put, rinse your hands a bit. Put the soap. Lather the soap for 20 seconds. And be very specific about it being at least 20 seconds. And then, of course, that changed to like a minute or whatever in some places. But basically, there was a set time you had to wash your hands. And then, on top of washing your hands with soap, lather soap for 20 seconds, rinse your hands for another 30 seconds. And then the funny thing is, like, ironically, we've gone backwards into a more ritualized form of washing our hands. Because COVID, right? So it's kind of one of those funny. It's just one of those funny things that you look at modern people. You look at us as modern people today, and we think, oh, we've moved past the backward thinking of the ancient world. It's like, no, not really, not really. But that's just a funny example. But we do that with a lot of things. We do that with a lot of things of how we live. Because once again, you think of like how in the ancient world you ritualized activities. It was to put significance instead of just kind of doing whatever with your life and treating life like it was, going through the motions, but rather you take time with everything you do. That was how the ancient world did things because life was more fragile back then in the ancient world. These ritual systems were developed to have people appreciate life a lot more. So that's why they ritualize a lot more stuff. Whereas as modern people, because for the most part, life is a lot more, not guaranteed is the best word, but we're way better off in the world today. Thank God for modern medicine and technology. We're way better in the world today than these people were in the ancient world. Duh. And so we don't feel the need to ritualize everyday living because, well, for the most part, we feel pretty confident that we're not just going to die out of the blue for some stupid ass reason. There's not going to be an immediate war from some, warring tribe from who knows where, next week. We don't really think that's going to happen. That's why we don't really ritualize daily activities. But in the ancient world, that's obviously what they did. And in the first century here, as we read in the book of Luke, yeah, obviously washing your hands was one of those things that was ritualized for that reason. And this delicious snack here, but I'm not going to eat it quite yet. we're gonna finish chapter 11 first, and then I'm gonna take a short break, eat my snack, and then we'll continue with chapter 12. Okay, so there's this whole thing about Jesus not doing the ritual cleaning, and Jesus points out, well, you may think you're good enough by doing the ritual cleaning, but what about the way you live? How about your behaviors? And this also is something that we've adopted into modern culture. And so once again, it's one of those things that, like, because we're so far in the future now compared to the Bible times, we're so far in the future, we tend to think that we developed these on our own, but that didn't happen. Obviously, this is a long tradition. Like a lot of things we take for granted in a North American culture was adopted from these Christian ideas. That's what I was getting at. And once again, as I've mentioned many a time before, it's one of those things that, like, why the Bible is important to read anytime, because a lot of things we take for granted in, like, philosophy and philosophical thought and modern culture actually comes from ideas that the Bible began, and the Bible started expounding on these ideas, and then we kind of evolve them, and then unfortunately we've taken them so far for granted, we've disassociated them from their source, if that makes sense. And so one of those things is how, as modern people, it's not the ritual that's so important anymore, but about the behavior of how you live. So going back with the washing hands things, for example, you don't have to do this ritualized, first rinse your hands, then get some soap, then lather your hands for a good 20 seconds to a minute. Then you rinse your hands for basically the equal amount of time you lathered your hands. And then you got to take the paper towel and use the paper towel to turn off the sink so you don't get your wet hands on the faucet. So instead, as we evolve thought, we just go, okay, I know the general sense is to do hygiene. I wash my hands the way I want to. And how long I use soap and stuff like that, I can figure that out myself. I don't need someone else to tell me how long I need to use soap. That kind of thing. Because that was an idea, that comes from a Christian idea. That it's not so much about the ritual itself, but you being self-aware of you knowing how to clean your hands. And you had to know how to practice good hygiene. And so Jesus talks about here in a spiritual sense and uses the metaphor of, like, plates and dishes, about how, sure, you can wash the outside of a cup, but on the inside you're full of greed and malice and all these other things. And going back with, the light and dark thing, light, dark, dark, light, open Kingdom Hearts, it's about how you fill the inside of your being and what you expose yourself to. And by extension, how that plays out in your behaviors. And so Jesus goes back on this, and we talked about this in great length back in I can't remember which chapter it was. It was a few weeks ago when I was reading. I think it was probably like week 3 or week 4 of the Bible reading streams this year, because that was like the middle, like Luke 6 or Luke 5 or something. But basically, the importance of our behaviors, the continual attitudes that we have that then dictate how we live. And Jesus says, well, that's more important than just doing the rituals. Because anyone can do the rituals. Anyone can fake it long enough. And, the phrase fake it till you make it doesn't necessarily apply to your behaviors, is what Jesus is getting at. And so when Jesus criticizes the teachers here of, like, well, in the inside you're full of greed and malice, he's pointing out that, like, well, so what if you know the rituals? If you don't fix who you are on the inside, then rituals don't mean jack shit, is basically what Jesus is saying to them. And then Jesus continues by saying, well, think of it like this, like, oh, you built tombs, built tombs, and you think you're in honor of people, but at the same time, when you claim you build tombs to quote unquote honor the prophets, you also accept that it was your own ancestors that that killed them, and you accept that as well, or you ought to accept that, because that their gruesome deaths were on your families that caused that. And so Jesus is pointing out that it's the rituals don't matter as much as right behavior and right attitude, because those things is what dictates how we live. And then of course, I'm gonna skip over a bit of the details here, but basically Jesus points out particular things about how, like, oh, the Pharisees abuse their power, they abuse their quote unquote status in the religious world, being quote unquote right with God, and then claiming that, well, because you're right with God, you can do what you want. But that's not how it works. And so it's interesting that Jesus points that out in them. I'm just going to eat this quick snack because it is going to start getting cold. So I'm just take a short break here. If you have any questions about chapter 11, don't hesitate to ask. But I'm just going to eat this quickly so it doesn't get cold. This is like a mini samosa. Okay. Chapter 12 is kind of long. Ooh, that smells a little spicy. Oh, it's not that long. Okay, chapter 12. Well, it's not that long. So we're going to read chapter 12. Cover our 2 chapters for the week. But chapter 12 is also pretty rich in content. So here we go. Chapter 12. So meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands have gathered, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him after your body has been killed, has authority to throw you into hell. Oh yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet one of them is not forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than a few sparrows. I tell you, whoever publicly acknowledges me before others, the Son of Man, will also acknowledge before the angels of God. Sorry, I read that wrong. Let me try that again. Verse 8. I tell you, whoever publicly acknowledges me before others, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven. But anyone who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. When you are brought before the synagogues, rulers and authorities, do not worry about how you will defend yourselves or what you will say. For the Holy Spirit will teach you at that time what you should say. Now someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus replied, Dude, who appointed me to judge or be an arbiter between you? Then Jesus said to them, Watch out and be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions. And so he told them this parable. So he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And the man thought to himself, What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and then I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Therefore I say to you, do not worry about this life, about what you will eat, or about your body, and what you will wear. For life is more than those things. Consider the ravens. They do not reap or sow. They have no storehouse or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I say to you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you? O you of little faith! And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. You don't need to worry about it. For the pagan who runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Don't be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail. There is where no thief comes near, nor a moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master in return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself to serve, and will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants who the master finds them ready, even if he comes back in the middle of the night or toward daybreak. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Peter then asked, Lord, why are you telling this parable to us or to everyone? Then the Lord answered, Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for the servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Or sorry, it would be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Verse 44. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, My master is taking a long time in coming. And then he begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and to eat, drink, and get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware. He will cut him into pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready or does not do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punish will be beaten with few blows. From everyone who has been given much, much must be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Now I have come to bring fire on earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-laws against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. So Jesus said to the crowds, When you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, It's going to rain. And it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, It is going to be hot. And it is. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? So why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversary may drag you off to the judge, and the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you now, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Okay, so that's the end of the reading part. But chapter 12, there's a lot in here. Oh man, I don't even know where to start with this one. So, the first one is basically the importance of, in the Christianese world, we say the confession. You know, to acknowledge ourselves before God and to be okay with being public about it. And it's one of those things that, you know, yeah, there's the whole, in our, you know, liberal world, you know, people are entitled to their ideas and whatnot. But of course, we're also told, oh, you always have to keep, you know, it's always in private though. And that you just keep your like beliefs and stuff to yourself. But at the same time, you know, you have to be bold in what you stand for and what you believe. And so, you know, in the religious sense and in the Christian sense, it's like, well, no, we ought to be bold that we believe in Jesus and who he is and who he says he is, and not be ashamed of that. Because it's so easy, you know, in a culture like ours where everything can be made fun of, you gotta take a stand on what you gotta take a stand on what you believe. And if people make fun of you for it, well, that's just how it is. But Jesus states to his disciples, sure, there's stuff in this life that you may have hardship because of him, but how much you have to think more than just this life. And that's fundamentally one of the main themes of chapter 12 is you have to think beyond this. I mean, this is obviously true in a lot of the other chapters as well. But in chapter 12, its primary focus is about focusing on the life to come. And of course, in the Jewish mindset, this would be a duh. As I mentioned before about the Jewish thinking of how the resurrection works. And so, the resurrection being their understanding of the afterlife. And so, oh, excuse me. Oh, that tired feeling is coming on. But I'll make it through chapter 12. We're going to finish this. But basically, Jesus is saying, no, you have to think about the life to come. But there are prerequisites. Ooh. One of them is, in the life we live now, in this life, you cannot be ashamed of your faith and being a follower of Jesus. And this is definitely something that a lot of Christians today easily relate to, because Christianity is one of those like major bullied groups now. Oh, how the tables have turned. Where people would say, well, Christians deserve to be bullied because they were the oppressors before, which is kind of really shitty behavior. And it goes back to that whole oppression Olympics thing, as I mentioned before. But a lot of people, bully Christians because their justification is, well, Christians did a lot of bad things to, for example, like in North America, it's so easy to blame, like, well, it was Christian culture that led white people to destroy the natives. And so that's why a lot of people feel justified in, hating on Christians in the world today. And yeah, it sucks. But at the same time, what Jesus is saying in chapter 12 here, and something that every Christian should remember, and to focus on what's more important, to not be ashamed of who Jesus is, even if, yes, people in the past did bad things, but once again, if you wanted to be, if people were intellectually honest, I mean, Christians are just people like anyone else. And so it's not like they alone destroyed entire civilizations. People before them destroyed other civilizations. We're even getting it. I mean, if you want to be really technical about it, if every civilization that exists today got to where they were by crushing a whole bunch of other people. I mean, I guess that's also why it's easy to be racist toward Asian people, because Asian people are, well, they're all a bunch of mean-ass conquerors. Thanks, Genghis Khan. But, like, thanks, Genghis Khan, for making everyone hate us. But, in all seriousness, back to Jesus saying, well, don't be ashamed of him. And Jesus says, well, whoever confesses me, I will confess before the angels. And so that's a reassurance that Jesus gives to his followers, that yeah, the world's going to be rough with you. And it was definitely true for the disciples back then, and it is true for Christians today. The world will always be rough with people who follow Jesus. But you can't look at just this life. Even though, to be fair, it's easy to get caught up in this life because, well, you're in it. But at the same time, you have to think about the life to come, and you can be rejected from that life if you deny Jesus, because then Jesus will say, well, if those who acknowledge me will be acknowledged, and those who don't will not be. Well, that's a pretty scary thought of not acknowledging Jesus in this life, and then you get to the afterlife, and Jesus is like, who the hell are you? I don't know you. Get out of here. Which is, various parables play on this idea. I know a lot of people will focus on that one parable. I think it's in Mark. Matthew probably has it too. But there's a one parable about this this dining feast that this master of the house holds, and he says, well, invite anyone to come. And then some random guy just shows up who wasn't invited necessarily. He just shows up, and then the master's like, who the hell are you? How'd you get in here? Someone get this bum out of here. And then, you know, it gets pretty rough for that guy. But basically, in this and going back to the Luke passage, it's talking about how, yeah, you know, this life can be rough, but you gotta think ahead. You gotta think to the life to come, and how important it is to recognize and confess Jesus, because if you don't in this life, well, he's not going to bother with you in the next life. He's just going to be like, who the hell are you? Right? Like, go away. And that's a pretty scary thought. And Jesus extends this metaphor with the famous, do not fear the ones who can kill your body, but fear the one who can kill your soul. Which I remember there was this funny, unrelated note. I remember there's this Bible program on TV one time, and this guy was using the Bible to say that the philosophy, you know, Greek philosophy is basically wrong in the idea of the immortal soul. And then his justification was, well, in the Bible, Jesus talks about how God can kill the soul. And then I thought for a minute, I was like, well, yeah, that's true. But at the same time, Greek philosophy put that into account. Well, not in the same way that the Bible does, obviously. But they put that into account. They're not talking about what God can and can't do. Greek philosophy, when it mentions the immortal soul, talks about the part of you that exists beyond this life, and how important it is to nurture it. Which is why that's the actual importance of the immortal soul philosophy, if you actually read that up. The idea is that there's a part of us that's immortal, the immortal soul. And everything we do in life must foster that so that it can be prepared for what the afterlife has to come. Because we don't know what's in Greek philosophy, the idea was we didn't know what was in the afterlife. So you've better foster your soul in a way that could be worthy of that life. And so that's why we need to develop good ethics. And hence, philosophy of ethics was born from that too. But anyway, I remember this Bible program talking about how, like, well, God can kill the soul, so therefore the soul's not immortal. But I remember thinking, like, well, that's not a good argument, because God is the exception to all rules. God writes the rules and can rewrite them at any time. So God could be today, I can make the soul immortal, and then tomorrow say, I can make the soul not immortal. God can rewrite the rules at any time, and so that is not a valid argument. But I remember this passage about how God can, quote unquote, kill the soul, or in the Luke version says, send it to hell, which is basically the same thing. But basically, it goes back to what the Greeks were getting at with the immortal soul idea, and it was that there's a part of you that exists beyond this life, and it needs to, and we should do what we can to foster ourselves for the upcoming life. But of course, one of the things about the Bible is that the Bible says, well, actually, we have the answer to that, and that is to be in a right relationship with God, and that's how you prep yourself for the next life. That is what decides whether you are worthy or not worthy of the resurrection. And that was how the Bible presents that idea of what will happen in the afterlife. And so, going back to what Jesus says here in the beginning of chapter 12, when he tells his disciples, don't worry about what people can do to you in this life, but fear the one that can send your soul to hell, who has the power to do that. And then he, of course, Jesus gives them the way out by saying, well, if you acknowledge the Son of Man will acknowledge you. And so, by extension of that, if the Son of Man acknowledges you, then you're good. Because remember, with the whole Daniel discourse I've done in my earlier Luke readings, I mentioned, the Son of Man as this divine figure is like the top of the top. Because the whole joke of God calls the Son of Man God, so I guess I guess you should call him God too. And so when Jesus makes that claim here about how if you acknowledge the Son of Man will acknowledge you, I mean, that's a pretty big deal. That's a huge deal. Because once again, this is the guy who God calls God. So think of it like the translative logic like this. So the Son of Man, who God calls God, he then says about you, you are worthy of joining me in the afterlife. And so the Son of Man possesses this authority, and when he says that you are worthy or you're not worthy, that word is final. And that word is like, no one else can override. No one can override that. No one can say, actually, no one can do that. If the Son of Man says you are worthy, then you are worthy. End of story. And so that's a pretty big deal. And I think that's where, Jesus giving them that confidence in his disciples, saying, well, just acknowledge me and the Son of Man will acknowledge you. And so which is weird to think. And once again, it's one of those things that people can be skeptical about, because that's like a thing that's like almost too good to be true kind of thing. Like how could just me acknowledging Jesus as the Christ be what makes me worthy for the afterlife? Because there's a lot of things I've done in life, and all of us can agree to this, in our own lives. We can all say that we've all done things that clearly make us unworthy. And this is where, once again, the Christian idea of faith in Jesus ultimately is what brings salvation. This is where that idea comes from. At least in the Luke context. It's the faith in Jesus that makes you worthy. And so here, Jesus is giving, he basically tells them that it's your belief and your acknowledging of who Jesus is and believing in him and following him and all that. That is what makes you worthy. Because even though we've all done things that make us unworthy of, being right with God, we've all done things that make us unworthy. But we can be made worthy by belief in Jesus, ultimately. And that's what Jesus is getting at here, and that's a fundamental Christian idea. And that's fun. That's like one of the cruxes of Christian thinking. If you don't have that, then you really don't have anything else, because, that's how Jesus here defines that. That's how people become, they become saved. And then the transitive logic Jesus uses that because as you acknowledge God, in the Son of Man, who has the authority, can say, yes, you're worthy, and no one can dispute that. Which is a scary thing on one hand, but on the other hand, it's assuring, because then in our faith in Jesus, we can be assured that we are made right with God because God said so, basically. Which is, once again, the whole God calls the Son of Man God, so I will use that interchangeably. But basically, we are right with God because God said so. And that's good enough for me. All right, you say I'm good, then we're good, right? That's awesome. I know some people get a little skeptical, because that is a little bit too good to be true at times. But that's what Jesus is assuring of his disciples here. Because the contrast is, this life will always be rough. Just how it is. Life ain't easy. And it will never be easy. But when we believe in God, then God will give us, new life. And he has given us his word, which is as good as it gets, basically. And so the interesting contrast is everything in this world, it's fleeting. It'll all wither away and die eventually as death comes for us all. But the word of God, and this is where, there's that famous passage that also gets, cited all the time by Christians. The word of God will always endure. And part of that is this promise that Jesus gives to his disciples, to say, like, well, if you acknowledge me, then I will acknowledge you, and that is an assurance you have. And once again, because the Son of Man, God calls him God, you have the best word in for you of making you worthy, to join, God in paradise, right? In the afterlife. You have that assurance because God has given you his word. And that's the TLDR of this whole bit here. And yeah, there's other stuff about how watch out for the Pharisees and don't be worried about how to protect yourself because the Spirit will do that. It's once again, it's the whole like there's gonna be a lot of challenges in this life, but with God you will always be taken care of. And that's a thing that's a continual theme throughout Luke as well. And this is one of those things that like obviously there's an appeal to, and I hate using this because once again people use the same logic to make their own twisted ideas of the world. And so on the one hand, God will provide and will take care of our physical, spiritual, and whatever needs. But that doesn't mean, the communists, no one has anything rhetoric. Which I know a lot of people actually use like passages like this to kind of justify, this is why we shouldn't need money and stuff like that. Because then everyone would just take care of each other and whatever. And then we can have a moneyless society and whatever. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Careful there. Because the big danger of when people try and promote that idea is, well, who gets to take the role of God? Because here, Jesus talks about how, well, God will provide for us in whatever needs that we have. And of course, one of the things that I know it can be dissatisfactory to hear this, but Jesus only really makes that promise about the next life. Not so much with this life. In this life, Jesus says there will be hardship, there will be trouble. You must, there must be a time for fighting. I've come to give you a sword kind of rhetoric that Jesus gives. That's this life. And the whole like God will take like this utopian world. And that's the danger of talking about utopias in a nutshell, is that utopias don't exist in this world and they never can. And that's something that people have to be realistic with. And that's why, yeah, I say like, okay, I'm a Christian, but at the same time I don't believe in things like a moneyless society. And I know some people say that's contradictory because the Bible says God will take care of all our needs, so you don't need to worry about money. You should just sell your possessions. Like, whoa, 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 buddy, slow down. That's not exactly how it works, because that whole utopian world you're looking at ain't this life, and it doesn't work in this life. And so this is where, once again, it's the faith in Jesus that will save you, not trying to build utopia in this life, because it will never happen. Okay, so talking about this whole contrast of, and I know this part's always tough to talk about because I know in North American culture we clearly live in a way that may appear contradictory to the Bible here, in that, for instance, the average person doesn't just sell their possessions and give to the poor, because of course the other problem is, well, if nobody has money, right? Then I know a lot of people, like all the socialists and communists, talk about how, like, see, if nobody had money, then nobody would be poor. But at the same time, if there was no money and stuff like that, there would be no incentive for growth, and then people would just go backwards and resort to tribal fighting, which is another big problem. And you can read the Old Testament for that problem. But at the same time, when Jesus talks about like selling your possession, whatever, he's talking about not being greedy and not hoarding stuff, and that's something that Americans can be quite guilty of. That we can be hoarders, and so there's a moderation that must be met. But I have to kind of go headbutting, and I understand I'm going to be headbutting with other Christians in this debate, but sure, Jesus talks about how, we are to be generous and sell your possessions and give to the poor, but at the same time, that does not mean to wither yourself out and have nothing. Because, as we read in the beginning of chapter 11, there was this whole, we have an obligation to demand stuff when we are generous to people. We have an obligation because you can't create a society of spoiled brats. Well, once again, in Luke 11, that was a more like a individualistic way of looking at it. God demands things out of people so that humans learn to be demanding and to have ambition. And in chapter 11, I talked about it more on an individualistic way of, like, that on a more individualistic level. But as we read through here in chapter 12, you can kind of see the same principles in chapter 11, but they're more societal based. And they apply to much larger groups of people. Even though obviously Jesus is just talking to his disciples, but he's giving them a framework of how people ought to live with one another and be good to each other. And so, of course, there's moderations within that, because the other problem we'll run into as well, and there'll always be those smartasses that talk about, well, the book of Acts contradicts the book of Luke because the way that the Christians live. Well, they didn't sell everything. They obviously had their own property, and then hell, there's even a couple that's killed for selling all that they have and then bragging about it. So there's that too. And so, well, what gives? And I think one of the things that we should be morally intelligent about is that when Jesus says these things about, oh, sell your possession, whatnot, he's reminding us of, don't get too caught up in this life, but rather focus on the life to come. That doesn't mean, though, that you just, dump this life behind, because this life is meant to prepare you for the life to come with, in the presence of God, in his wholeness. And so, and in his fullness, not wholeness, in his fullness. And so that's something that we as people need to be very conscious of. And that's something that, I've been thinking quite a bit about, when, and this is one of those things that, once again, as you get older and you want to do things like get married, whatever, or even those who are not that stage yet, those of you who want to start your own businesses or whatever and be successful in life, the more important thing that Jesus talks about in these stories, and there's that whole thing about, well, I'm transitioning to the parable of the rich fool here, which is verse 13 to 21. There's that whole thing about how there's nothing wrong with, say, preparing for the future, but at the same time, you should be focused on the life to come, because that will be more important. And this life that we have here is not the end. This is not the end. And so you should prepare yourself, yes, but at the same time, don't get too caught up in this life, because what if God is ready to call you to the next one prematurely? You might not be ready for it. Well, you live this life to be ready for the next one. You don't live, this life is not an end to itself, but rather it means to, well, the future. And so, and I know that this can be a little uncomfortable, because I know people don't like this idea of well, oh, everything's about a future world, instead of what about this, everything's about some future world, instead of caring about stuff here. But it's not, I mean, once again, there's a level of moderation. You have to balance two. You have to balance the two, because both of them are important. But what the Bible is doing here is to really put emphasis on the life to come in the resurrection. And yeah, Jesus makes the point of that is more important than this life. That is true. But at the same time, I am also saying, on and once again, because other parts of Scripture will contradict this part as well. And I know some people, this is one of those critiques people have about the Bible as well. They say, well, the Bible contradicts itself a lot, where there's passages like this where Jesus focuses solely on the life to come. And then people get the impression that Jesus doesn't care about this life. But then you get other parts where Jesus clearly cares about what you do in this life. So what gives is probably what you're thinking. But as we read through chapter 12, I think the more important thing to get out of it is to understand that your life is meant for more than what is here now. And so all the struggles you face as well, don't let that put you down. Don't get too caught up in the good things in it too. Don't get too caught up in your victories. Like the rich fool story does. The guy gets too caught up in his victories that he doesn't know that his time is going to run out. And so that is something we should always be mindful of. And the way that God carries us through life, and going back and forth between how we deal and carry ourselves in this life, and then how we are before God and live with God in a way in the next life. There's a back and forth between that, and there's an interesting dialogue that goes on. But as far as chapter 12 is concerned, it just wants to remind us of how important it is to not get caught up in this life alone, because that's a very dangerous way of living. Because then, well, what would you do? And good luck trying to justify yourself on like, oh, well, why didn't you believe in Jesus in this life? Why didn't you obey his commandments of being good to other people, yada yada yada? Why didn't you do that in the first life that you had? Because of course the other thing too to consider is that this life is meant to train you in a sense for the next life, because if we're all going to be living in the New Jerusalem together, we better be good to each other at that point. You don't want the Bible 2 to happen. So who knows? But it's just a interesting thing to consider in how we live. Anyway, chapter 12 has more of the whole don't worry about this life thing. And there's that whole thing about, I'm going to skip it actually. There's a whole thing about like from verse 22 to verse 34. 22 to 34, I already talked about that in great detail, because once again, the entire, like a lot of chapter 12 is about this. It is not to get too caught up in this life. Don't worry about what you will eat tomorrow, whatever. But rather, focus on God, and then everything else will be added to you. And of course, what the Bible isn't saying is that there aren't worries in this life. You can't be truly carefree and just be like free love and whatever. That's not how it works. The Bible isn't saying that. What the Bible is saying is that you don't need to get too caught up in this life, because God will take care of you. And it's never in a one-to-one way that we like to think. People tend to, and this is where, like, once again, people tend to think of like prayer as like the magic 8-ball. It's like, God, I pray for this, and then you hope like boom, it happens. It doesn't happen that way. I mean, if you guys watch my Monday podcast, I talked about this kind of thing with my own love life story. And I never would have thought that I'd have met my girlfriend the way I did. Because if either of us got what we wanted back when we met, and the kind of directions we thought our lives were going to, we wouldn't be together today, that's for sure. And I wouldn't trade what we have now, kind of thing. Because, yeah, God provides for other needs in our lives. Because it's so easy to think like, well, I want to be pastoring in some, I want to be pastoring in a church as soon as I finish seminary or whatever, and stuff like that. And, she was thinking she was going to be Bible translating all over the world. Neither of that happened. And, but at the same time, God God provided for us in other ways. And one of those ways that I see in, as I live today, is that we have each other and we make a great team. And everything, a lot of things have been so much better for us because we have each other, that kind of thing. Which I know sounds mega tacky and, just some person reveling in their love life. But it's true, though, that God provides for us in other ways, too. And then by extension, you know, through my love life kind of thing, I've I've grown much more spiritually and stuff like that. And that, and in a way, that spiritual growth I went through, that will carry me over more into, well, the next life. When Christ returns, or if Christ returns sooner than later, or if I die and go into the next life, and so, which is basically when Christ returns. So, but funny time travel stuff. We can always talk about the fun philosophy behind that one. But what I'm getting at, though, is that when we read the passage of "Do not worry," and there's the whole thing where, like, a lot of people get this false impression of, like, well, they think the Bible says that you don't have to worry about anything in life, which is kind of ridiculous. But more accurately is, God will always provide for you, even if it's in a way you don't think it's going to, even a way you don't expect it to, which is why I told the love story earlier. I never thought, I had prayed for a lot of things in life, and I never got it the way I prayed it, but God had always provided something that, now that I look back on it, is better. Is so much better, because God has higher interests and knows how to fulfill deeper parts of, well, the human being, the things that you and I need on a much more deeper level. So I think that's kind of something to be reminded of in this passage of the "don't worry" passage. What the Bible isn't saying is that you can live your life carefree, because that's kind of ridiculous. But what the Bible is saying is that in whatever circumstances, in this life and in the next life, and of course, considering that God does put more emphasis on the next life, even though God puts more emphasis on it, that doesn't mean God will not provide a way, because he does. And I mean, I know that the textbook answer is like, well, through belief in the Son, which is a duh. But how that goes about and how you live that out, God will provide those ways for you. And that's what the Bible is really saying in the "don't worry" passage. It's not about, oh, just have nothing and be poor forever, and God will be happy then. That's kind of silly. God doesn't demand that you destroy yourself. Because then that, people who've taken these kind of passages to their extremes are those, like, I know this is going to be unsavory, but all those, like, suicidal cults. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Yeah. Cults like that come from people taking this passage way too, like, too extreme, and thinking, like, you'll be happy if you have nothing, which is, once again, kind of a silly idea. But what the Bible is saying is that God will take care of you. In ways you don't expect it, of course, but he will always take care of you. See, then I'm going to move on. I'm going to transition to a part that apparently contradicts. Well, it's okay to just say it flat out contradicts at times. It contradicts the part we just read. So this is part where Jesus talks about the servant who is the good servant who waits for his master and does, and waits on his master. The wordplay. Waits on his master and waits for his master. And then there's the bad servant who thinks, oh, my master's not coming back anytime soon, and, beats the other servants, gets fat, gets drunk, and then the master comes back and is like, yo, what the hell's going on here? And so this passage talks about how you ought to live in this life, this readiness, this willingness to serve God, this readiness to do what's right, etc., etc. Because, we read these other passages, the "don't worry" passage, and the passage about, God caring about the next life. But he clearly cares about this life too, because he tells this parable about the servants waiting on their master and how they ought to be prepared for the master's coming. Like, obviously, there's elements of, once again, it's still talking about the next life and the resurrection and all that stuff. But what's important in this context here, in the later part of Luke 12, is God does care about how you conduct yourself in this life. Because if you're being a bad servant, well, you're going to get thrown out. And there's that part where it kind of sounds funny, where it's like the person who was not expected to do good, and so he does bad, they only get punished a little bit. But the person who was expected to do good but does evil gets severely punished. And so I know there's the other passage about like teachers being judged harshly or whatever. By transient of logic. If I were to be a terrible human being to you guys, for instance, then I would be judged more harshly, and that would be true. Because, well, one, I'd be committing religious evil for starters. Because, as a Christian, I like to believe I'm representing God to you. So if I become a bad person, if I act badly, then that taints the image of God for you. And that would be, that's a big no-no. That was, going back to the 10 Commandments, that's commandment number 3 right there. And so, big no-no. But in this case here, the story of the servants, it does sound like it's contradicting the earlier stuff about like, oh, you don't need to worry too much about this life. God will care for us and make us a way to be with him in the next life. That's obviously true. But you still have to do what's right and be a follower of Jesus in this life too. So both are clearly important. And I think chapter 12 does a whole like marriage between those two ideas. And if anything, you learn anything from this stream, I know it's kind of all over the place today, because chapter 11 and 12 there's just so much to talk about, but I only have like 2.5 hours. So, and we're running to the end of that 2.5 hours now. But basically, if you're going to learn anything from me this week, is that God cares. He always cares for us, whether it's in this life or the next life. And now we have the obligatory water noise. Okay, I think it's okay now. The obligatory water noise is gone. So, if you're going to learn anything from me this week, is that God will always care for us, whether it's this life or the next life. Because even though chapter 12 does make an emphasis on there is a next life, and you better be ready for it. And there are other things to talk about in regards to that, but we'll cover that in the future when it's more relevant. I mean, yeah, they're kind of like things that's just kind of commonplace in Christian thinking, but going along with the transient of logic in the book of Luke, we'll save it for later. But basically, the tension between the two, this life and the life to come, if you will, the assurance we have is that Jesus will provide a way. And that is something that we can be assured of, because Lordy, this life is hard enough as it is, and who knows what happens in the next. And, none of us have any idea what we would do. But Jesus has made a way. And Jesus says back in chapter 11, well, if you acknowledge the Son of Man, the Son of Man will acknowledge you, and that's good enough. That's good enough. That's as good as it gets, though, right? It's not just good enough; it's as good as it gets. And so, I think that's something that we need to be reminded of all the time, and it's an important reminder because once again, as this life, continuously has its hardships and challenges, we need to be reminded that God is with us in our struggles. And so I leave that with you, and I hope that brings some peace of mind to you. But anyway, I think I'm done with chapter 11 and 12 because boy howdy, that was a lot, and it's pretty thick, and there's so much more to say, but I had to cram quite a bit, and so that's why I know some things may feel disjointed because I had to jump from section to section, and I really don't want to resort to just doing one chapter a week because that sounds like it would hurt. I mean, I know I'm not doing a stream this Monday. I'm not doing a podcast this Monday. We're going to skip this week for obvious reasons. So, with that said, we can come back to some of this. I will come back to some of the stuff in this passage. But I'll kind of do it on a more philosophy take. Like the Immortal Soul thing, we'll definitely come back to that. And how we should view that philosophy accurately. We will definitely come back to that one, for instance, on a podcast. Not this Monday, obviously, but we'll come back to it in a podcast. And there are a few other things in the book of Luke we can always come back to in podcasts as well. Because, like I said, there's so much in here we could talk about, but I only have 2 hours and a half. And so I know it feels like I'm not doing it justice by rushing, but at the same time, I also want to get through the book of Luke. And I don't want to be one chapter or even less than that in a week. So that's kind of how it'd be. Anyway, just do some housekeeping. I should do a stream on Wednesday. I should be around on Wednesday. Because I know I'm skipping Monday. So Wednesday we're going to stream. I don't know what we're streaming yet, though. But that will probably be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So next Wednesday, what was that, the 16th? The 16th of February, we'll stream at 3 o'clock Pacific time. I don't know what I'm going to stream yet. We'll see what I end up streaming. The next Thursday, we have Throwback Thursday video with Here's My Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty. And then finally, next Friday, we have another Bible read where we will do chapter 13 and 14. And so that's the next week of streams and videos. Pretty straightforward. And yeah, it's simpler next week because both streams will be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So hopefully that'll be easier to remember. Anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed going through the book of Luke, reading Luke 11 and 12 with me. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Happy Valentine's Day, I guess, even though it's not for another couple of days. But obviously I'm not going to say it to you on Valentine's Day because, like I said, I won't be here. So, happy Valentine's Day. I hope you guys have a great weekend. I'll see you guys next week at 3 o'clock, Wednesday, for some kind of game stream. I don't know what I'm doing yet. But next Wednesday, 3 o'clock, I'll see you guys. Leave a like, subscribe if you hit that notification so that hopefully YouTube will tell you. But notification things they're bad. That's all I need to say. They're bad. But 3 o'clock, I'll see you guys. But I gotta get going now, so good night and God bless you.